Today we're putting God on trial. And what's the charge? Inconsistent justice. The evidence is case after case where the same sins get different punishments based not on what people did, but for some reason who they were. If God's justice is truly perfect, then why does it look so arbitrary? Of course, many Christians will tell you that everything that God does is perfectly just, even when he does things that, by any human standard, seem evil. The destruction of entire cities, the death of innocent children, plagues, famines, and even mass genocide, all justified because, as the argument goes, God is sovereign. His justice is perfect. So if God's justice is truly perfect, it should be consistent, right? Shouldn't the same sins be met with the same punishments, no matter who commits them? That's not what we actually see in the Bible, though. Instead, we find countless examples of blatant favoritism, double standards, and even outright contradictions in how God chooses to punish people. And we're going to talk about 7 of them today, and in my opinion, number 7 is the biggest example in the Bible that proves the unjust nature of God. So let's do something fun today. If you're a Christian or a believer, start out by giving this video a thumbs down. Now, if I lay out my case well enough today, you don't have to give me a thumbs up, but you can at least remove the thumbs down. Fair enough? And atheists and skeptics, we've got our work cut out for us today, so please help me out, balance out the thumbs down, and give this video a thumbs up, please. I honestly can't wait to see how this works out. So, is God really just? Or is divine justice far more arbitrary than we've been led to believe? Well, court is now in session. Case number 1, David and Saul. So let's start with a classic case, King David versus King Saul. We've got 2 kings, 2 major sins, but for some reason we have wildly different outcomes. Now, Saul was Israel's first king, and by all accounts, he wasn't a terrible ruler. What was his biggest mistake? Just a hasty sacrifice. We see this in 1 Samuel 13. Saul grows impatient while waiting for the prophet Samuel, so he offers a sacrifice himself, which was supposed to be done by a priest. Now later in 1 Samuel 15, God commands Saul to wipe out the Amalekites, but Saul spares their king and some livestock instead. And for that, God rejects him as king. Not only that, God sends an evil spirit that actually torments Saul for the rest of his life. Now let's talk about David, the so-called man after God's own heart. David's sins compared to Saul's are way worse. Adultery. He sleeps with another man's wife, that was Bathsheba. Murder. He has her husband killed to cover up his adultery. And we see deception as he lies and manipulates the story to protect himself. And yet, David is not rejected. Instead, God lets him remain king. And the only punishment that happens here? His baby dies. Now, you could argue that's much heavier of a punishment for the baby than for King David himself. So why was Saul completely abandoned over a sacrifice? But David, a murderer, was forgiven. Could it be that God's justice is not about morality, but rather who he chooses to favor at the time? That doesn't sound like a just system. It sounds like a rigged one. And in this case, I find God guilty. Case number 2, Moses versus Uzzah. There's a weird rule in the Bible. Don't touch sacred things. But depending on who you are, God either lets it slide or he might kill you instantly. Moses, for example, touches the burning bush, which is God's literal presence in that story. He even argues with God and tries to refuse his mission. But what happens there? Nothing. Actually, no. Moses is rewarded and chosen to lead Israel. But fast forward to 2 Samuel 6, and we meet Uzzah. Uzzah is chosen to help transport the Ark of the Covenant, the holiest object in Israel. And the story goes that as the Ark is being transported, it starts to tip over, and Uzzah, acting on instinct, reaches out and he tries to steady the Ark with his hand. And what happens to him? God kills him on the spot. So how does Moses touch the divine and gets rewarded, but Uzzah, who's just trying to protect the ark, is struck dead? And honestly, if we think about it, this wasn't Uzzah's fault. It was David's fault. David was supposed to send the priests to carry the ark, but instead he puts the ark on a cart, and that's the whole reason why it was wobbling in the first place, and Uzzah felt the need to do something about it. So again, we see someone else paying the price for David's sin. This is not divine justice. It is inconsistent. Unless, of course, God's justice just means whatever he feels like at the moment. In case number 2, I also find God guilty as charged. For case number 3, we'll talk about Rahab versus Ananias and Sapphira. Lying is a sin, right? Proverbs 12:22 says that lying lips are an abomination to the Lord. But apparently, not all lies are equal. Rahab, for example, lies to protect Israelite spies. She tells the soldiers that the spies have left Jericho, when in reality, she's hiding them. And what does God do? He rewards her. She is spared, her family survives, and she's even made a part of the Israelite community. Now let's compare that to Ananias and Sapphira in Acts chapter 5. They also lie about keeping a donation, some of the money from their possessions that they sold and were supposed to give to the apostles. And for that, God strikes them both dead. Now, I can hear you saying, well, doesn't the motivation matter? You see, Rahab, she lied for a good reason. Ananias and Sapphira, they lied, but it was for a much more sinister reason. But is lying a sin? Well, it is one of the 10 commandments. And if lying is always a sin, why does Rahab get rewarded while Ananias and Sapphira get executed? If God is just, then he has to punish sin, right? Every single time. But here, he seems to only punish disobedience to him. That's a very big difference. In case number 3, God is guilty. Now, if you're finding this episode interesting, please take a moment to like this video and think about sharing it with someone else who might be interested in this type of topic. So at this point, we've seen how God judges sins wildly differently based on who the individual happens to be. Sometimes he lets the guilty walk free, and other times he hands out instant death sentences. So let's take a look at a few more glaring inconsistencies where God punishes the same crimes differently with no clear reason why. Again, if God's justice is perfect, then why does it keep changing? Now it's time to talk about murder. One of the clearest commandments in the Bible is thou shalt not kill. Exodus 20 and verse 13. And later in Exodus 21, we see that God's law explicitly states, whoever strikes a man so that he dies shall surely be put to death. It's pretty straightforward, right? If you murder someone, you die. But now let's take a look at the story of Cain back in Genesis chapter 4. And you know the story, Cain and Abel. Cain murders his own brother in cold blood. What does God do? Does he execute Cain like the later law demands? No. Does he punish him severely? No, not really. Instead, God puts a mark on Cain, and then for some reason, he chooses to protect him, saying that anyone who harms Cain is going to suffer 7 times worse than what they did. A man murders his own brother, and instead of punishing him, God ensures that no one can kill him. So why in later laws does God command death as the penalty for anyone who commits murder? But in Cain's case, he does the exact opposite, protecting him from being killed. That directly contradicts God's own laws, and it isn't justice. So in case 4, we have to find God again, guilty. Let's move on to case number 5, Pharaoh versus Nebuchadnezzar. One of the worst things you can do in the Bible is to oppose God's people, and yet, depending on who you are, God might destroy you completely, or he just might give you a temporary punishment and then restore you like nothing ever happened. In Exodus chapters 7 through 12, we find that Pharaoh refuses to let the children of Israel go. And so, what does God do? He sends 10 brutal plagues that end with the death of every firstborn child in Egypt. And then as Pharaoh's army chases the Israelites after they leave, God drowns them all in the Red Sea. Pharaoh's entire kingdom is devastated beyond repair. But let's fast forward to another story in Daniel 4, King Nebuchadnezzar, a Babylonian ruler who also opposes God's people. You see, Nebuchadnezzar, he invades Jerusalem, he destroys the temple, and he takes the children of Israel into captivity. He actually forces them to worship idols, and you know the story. If they don't, they get thrown into the fiery furnace. So what does God do in this case? Instead of plagues, instead of destroying Babylon, God gives Nebuchadnezzar a really strange punishment. He makes him act like an animal for a few years. And after that, God fully restores him back to his kingdom. So let me get this straight. Pharaoh is utterly destroyed for refusing to free slaves. But Nebuchadnezzar, who destroys God's temple and enslaves Israel, gets to return to power like nothing happened. So why does one ruler get total destruction while the other gets a temporary punishment and a happy ending? Again, in this case, we have to find God guilty. For case number 6, we're going to turn our attention to Lot's wife and Israel's complaints. We all know the story of Lot's wife. Genesis chapter 19, she and her family are fleeing Sodom as God rains down fire on the city. The only rule that they're given, don't look back. But when Lot's wife does, she is immediately turned into a pillar of salt. Now here's where it gets weird. Throughout the rest of the Bible, looking back at the past, or even wishing to return to a sinful place, is something that the Israelites do all the time. In Exodus 16, the Israelites complain about leaving Egypt. They said they had more food there. In Numbers 14, they literally say again, "Let us return back to Egypt." But does God turn them into salt? No. He scolds them, but he lets them keep complaining. So let's get this straight. Lot's wife looks back and is immediately turned into salt. But the Israelites, on the other hand, they complain for years about wanting to look back and return to Egypt, and they get off with a warning. So if looking back was so serious that Lot's wife had to die on the spot, why weren't the Israelites punished in the exact same way? Doesn't this just prove that God enforces his rules randomly? If this was a human judge, we would call this biased, inconsistent, and we would call for that judge's impeachment from the bench. But with God, we treat it differently. For some reason, it's okay when one group does a sin, but the death sentence is applied to someone else. This is another example where we have to find God guilty. And now we move on to number 7, the most glaring case of injustice in the Old Testament in my mind, which is Solomon versus other idol worshippers. And this is a huge double standard. Solomon, the son of David, builder of the temple, king of Israel. In 1 Kings 11, we're told that Solomon loved many foreign women and that they turned his heart toward other gods. So what did he do? He built altars for gods like Molech and Chemosh and Ashtoreth, some of the most detestable gods in the Bible. And we're not talking about just worshiping these gods in secret. Solomon built actual altars to these gods. He constructed places to worship them. And this is the same God who once demanded that Israel should wipe out entire nations for idol worship. Solomon does the exact same thing. So what's his punishment? Does God strike him dead on the spot? Maybe send plagues? Or have the earth open up and swallow him whole like he did with Korah? No, that's not what happened. Solomon finishes out his reign in peace. Now, God was angry, but the kingdom wasn't torn away from Solomon until after he died. Because God says, this is for the sake of David, his father. Now, Let's compare that to literally anyone else who dabbles in idolatry in the Old Testament. In Numbers 25, the Israelites worship Baal, and God sends a plague that kills 24,000 people. In Deuteronomy 13, the law says that if a member of your family tries to get you into idolatry, then they are to be killed. They get the death sentence for that. And in 2 Kings chapter 17, idolatry is explicitly named as the reason the northern kingdom was destroyed. But Solomon? Well, he builds altars, leads the nation into idolatry, and he gets no immediate punishment. No death, no exile. So if God's justice is truly righteous and impartial, why does Solomon get a royal exception? If idolatry is a death-worthy offense, how does the man who institutionalized it for Israel gets to die of old age, in peace? This isn't just inconsistent, it's theological nepotism and divine favoritism at its worst. And if this was a modern courtroom, we would call it exactly what it is. So on this count, we also have to find God guilty as charged. 7 out of 7. Guilty. So when Christians tell me that God's justice is perfect, the reason why these atrocities are justified in the Old Testament is because God is holy and he is just, and he has to go ahead and judge this sin. But then we see that God is judging this sin as inconsistently as possible. You can't use that excuse anymore. It doesn't stand up here, and it wouldn't stand up in a court of law. If God's justice is truly perfect, it has to be consistent. And instead, we see a clear pattern of contradictions and double standards. David got mercy, but King Saul, he was abandoned. Moses can touch the divine, but Uzzah is struck dead. Rahab's lie is praised, but Ananias and Sapphira must be executed. Lot's wife is turned into salt, but the Israelites can look back and complain, and nothing happens to them. Cain is protected from murder, but later murderers are executed with no mercy. And Pharaoh is utterly destroyed, but Nebuchadnezzar gets returned to glory. And last we saw that Solomon, he literally built altars to other gods, and he faced no judgment at all, while many others died for his offense. So we have to ask, is divine justice truly just? Or is it inconsistent and arbitrary? Of course, I want to know what you think about this one, so make sure you leave a comment below. Does God get a pass here? Does he get to do whatever he wants, or should he be held to the standard that he claims for himself? That he is just, and he is holy, and he has to judge sin? Let me know what your thoughts are in the comments, and if you enjoyed this video, make sure you're subscribed so you'll keep seeing content like this, and check out the New Testament for Skeptics series that we finished recently. I'll put it up on the screen so you can check it out. It talks about the errors, the contradictions, and the historical inaccuracies that we find all over the New Testament. It's been another episode of Faith in Question. Glad you joined us. Looking forward to seeing you on the next one.